continuing in the Chazara of Moed Katan, Daf Bet Amud Alef, where it says Mantana. So the first word on the line is Yityatevun, and then it says Mantana in the middle of that line. So it says the Gemara, Mantana de Peseda in Harvachalo. In our Mishnah, we learned that you're allowed to do malacha on Chol HaMoed for Peseda, to prevent a loss, but not for Harvacha, not to have a gain. And the second thing we learned in our Mishnah is even in a case where it's going to be a loss, if a person doesn't do the malacha, for example, watering a beit hashlachin, but mitrach nami lo tarchinan, you're not allowed to do extra tircha. Like we learned in the Mishnah that you're not allowed to get water from a well, that would be too much of a tircha. So 2 points we see in our Mishnah. Number 1, you're allowed to do malacha on Chol HaMoed only for pseida. And number 2, you're not allowed to do extra tircha. So who is the Tana that holds that way? Amar Rav Huna Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov he. Rav Huna says, you know who it is? It's Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Because again, our Mishnah didn't have any name to it. So now the Gemara is trying to find the name to match with our Mishnah. And we say it's Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. How do we know? Ditnan. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, he says, Moshchin et hamayim me'ilan le'ilan. If you have a field and you have some trees in the field, you're allowed to draw water from one tree to the next. You could basically create a small canal for the water to flow from one tree to another tree. But you can't water everything in the field, only the trees. So what do you see from there? You see that he holds that you're allowed to do malacha only for a beit hashlachin, because the Tosfot explains that a tree has the status of a beit hashlachin because it requires a lot of water, and if you don't feed it, the produce of the tree might die. Therefore, you're allowed to do malacha to make sure that the tree is watered on Yom Tov, so that you do not on Chol HaMoed, so that you do not lose out. So what do you see? You see Rabbi Eliezer holds like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov holds like our Mishnah. So says the Gemara, Amor dishma'at leile Rabbi Eliezer harvacha delo. What did we hear from Rabbi Eliezer? We hear that he holds harvacha delo, that when it comes to a gain, you're not allowed to do malacha for a gain. Because, again, you can only water the trees, which is like a beit hashlachin, which you'll incur a loss if you don't do that. But tircha b'makom peseda, that you're not allowed to do extra tircha in a case where you're going to lose out. Even if you'll lose out, you're not allowed to do extra tircha. Mi shematle, do we hear that from Rabbi Eliezer? Maybe he would allow you to do extra tircha in this case as well. So we see 1 point from Rabbi Eliezer, but he doesn't necessarily match our entire Mishnah. It could be that he does, but you don't see a proof that he agrees to both points in our Mishnah, only the first point. Ella Amar Rav Papa Hamani Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Papa says that the author of our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. Detanya. We learned as follows in a Braita. Ma'ayana yotze batechila mashkin mimenu afilu sedei bet habal. If you have a new spring, you're allowed to use it even to feed a beit habal. Now this is a very, very big chidush. You could use it even to feed a field which I would only be watering to gain. Divrei Rabbi Meir. That's Rabbi Meir's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Ein mashkin ella sedei beit hashlachin." You're only allowed to water a beit hashlachin shecharava, that dried out. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, lo kach velo kach. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, not like this and not like that. I believe the Gemara is going to get to that and explain what he means by that. Yeter al kein amar Rabbi Yehuda, lo yipaneh adam amat hamayim veyashke leginato ulchorvato. A person shouldn't either empty out or divert, depends how you read it. Is it yipaneh or yafneh? We'll read it as lo yipaneh adam amat hamayim. A person shouldn't divert a water canal, and he can't divert it to feed, to water his garden or his dry field, b'cholo shel moed, on Chol HaMoed. So, before the Gemara explains the Braita, let's just clarify the 3 opinions. Rabbi Meir was the most lenient. He said that you're even allowed to water a Beit Habal, you're even allowed to water a field that that I'm watering only to gain, even with a new spring. And we learned before that a new spring is something that may lead to tircha because you may have to repair it. And Rabbi Yehuda held that you're only allowed to water a beit hashlachin that dried out. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, not like this and not like that. Additionally, we had another statement from Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said you're not allowed to divert a water canal to feed even an area that's dried out. So the Gemara, before getting to the point, the Gemara just discusses the Braita a little bit. My charava, what does it mean when it says dried out? We're talking about a field, a beit hashlachin that dried out. Ele macharva mamash. If you're going to say that what it means is that it's completely dried out, so lama li demashkila. Why would a person be feeding it? Why would you be giving water to a field that is completely dried out? So Amar Abaye shecharva mimayan ze v'yatzala ma'ayan acher. Abaye says we're talking about a case that it dried out from one spring dried out, but a new spring emerged and it has a new water source. So the field was being irrigated, it dried out, now a new spring came about, and you want to use that new spring to water your field. So now we're getting to the next part of the Braita. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah omer lo kach v'lo kach. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said not like Rabbi Meir and not like Rabbi Yehuda. What does he mean lo kach v'lo kach? Not this and not that. So says the Gemara, lo shna charav ma'ayana v'lo shna lo charav ma'ayana. It doesn't matter if the water source dried out or if the water source did not dry out. Even if you have the water source that did not dry out, the halacha is ma'ayan shi'atza b'techila lo. You're not allowed to use a ma'ayan shi'atza b'techila, a new spring. Okay, so be it as it may, once we've brought the Braita, we see from this Braita that it seems like Rabbi Yehuda is the author of our Mishnah. Why? Because we're looking for somebody who agrees to two pieces of information. Number one, that you're allowed to feed only a beit hashlachin. You're not allowed to feed a field if it's to gain, only to prevent a loss. And number two, you're not allowed to do extra tircha. So we saw from Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said that you're only allowed to feed a beit hashlachin, right? Rabbi Yehuda said, "Ein mashkin el sadeh beit hashlachin shecharava." You're allowed to use even a newly emerged spring to feed a beit hashlachin. And further, Rabbi Yehuda said you can't divert the canal to feed the spring because that's an extra tircha. So you see, he agrees to both opinions. Number one, you're not allowed to feed you're only allowed to feed a beit hashlachin, and number two, you're not allowed to do extra tircha for it. So says the Gemara, umimai, how do you know it's Rabbi Yehuda? The Gemara is now going to interject and say a reasoning why maybe Rabbi Yehuda would not agree to everything in our Mishnah. Dilma, perhaps, adkan lo kama Rabbi Yehuda beit hashlachin in beit abal lo elamayan she'yatza b'techila. Meaning, Rabbi Yehuda, when he said you're allowed to feed a beit hashlachin and not a beit habal, you're allowed to do malacha to prevent a loss and not for a gain, not a beit habal, he only said that when it's a ma'ayan she'yatza b'techila, when it's a new spring, and there's a danger of having to work extra because the spring the walls might cave in and you'll need to do extra work on the spring. Dilma atilim pule, top of the next amud, that maybe the walls are going to cave in. Aval ma'ayan shelo yatza b'techila, but if it's a ma'ayan shelo yatza b'techila, if it's an old spring, then maybe Rabbi Yehuda will tell you delo atilim pule, that the walls of the old spring are not going to fall. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda will tell you afilu beit habal nami, you would even be allowed to feed a beit habal, to water a beit habal. So Rabbi Yehuda may not necessarily agree to our Mishnah, because our Mishnah was very clear that you, under no circumstances can you water a beit habal. Rabbi Yehuda maybe holds that you're allowed to water a beit habal with an old spring. So it's unclear, but perhaps, the Gemara is suggesting, perhaps there's room for Rabbi Yehuda to hold that way, therefore he may not necessarily be the author of our Mishnah. So the Gemara says, Imken matnitin aman teramiyeh. If that's the case, who are you going to throw our Mishnah on? Meaning, who could possibly be the author of our Mishnah? Ella rather it must be Rabbi Yehuda lo shna ma'ayan sheyatza b'techila v'lo shna ma'ayan shelo yatza b'techila. Beit hashlachin in, beit haba'al lo. It must be that according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's no difference between a new spring and an old spring. The halacha must be the beit hashlachin you're allowed to water, and a beit haba'al you're not allowed to water, just like our Mishnah, because there is no alternative Tana who could author our Mishnah. Therefore, it must match with Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda would have to agree with our Mishnah because he is the author of our Mishnah. So v'hai detani ma'ayan sheyatza b'techila. So if that's the case, if the author is Rabbi Yehuda, why does it say ma'ayan sheyatza b'techila? Why does it say, specifically mention a new spring? Let it say an old spring. Lo diacha kochod Rabbi Meir. Da'afilu ma'ayan yotze b'techila mashkin mimenu afilu sedei beit haba'al. It's telling you how far Rabbi Meir goes. His koach, the kocha de hetera of Rabbi Meir, that he's so lenient that even with a beit haba'al, he allows you to use even a new spring. That's why the Braita specifically lists new spring.